I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at TechTarget, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Chad Whitaker is head of open source at Sentry, an application and performance monitoring software maker that moved to a business source license for its products in 2019, and then to a functional source license in November 2023. Most recently, Chad has been working on a new project called Software Commons over the last 6 months, with the goal of balancing the user freedom prioritized by open source software with developer sustainability. Welcome, Chad.
Hi, Beth. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So this month you wrote an interesting blog post introducing Software Commons, and in it you discussed two problems with traditional open source, the tragedy of the commons and enclosure. So for those who are unfamiliar, can you give us a brief description of what those problems are?
So tragedy of the commons and enclosure are two ways that a commons can fail in general. So we talk about the software commons, which is an instance of a commons in general. So you have to think about a commons as like a meadow in medieval England where the villagers all bring their cows to graze. And there's kind of two, it's the common land that the people get to use. And there's two ways that that arrangement can break down for them. On the one hand, you've got this concept of enclosure, which is sort of like the lord of the manor comes along and puts a fence around the commons, and the common people no longer have access to it to graze their cows. And then the other is this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which is that over time there's more and more villagers with more and more cows, and there's more cows than the meadow can sustain. And so it turns into this mud field with all the cows trampling down the grass and overgrazing it. So on the one hand, enclosure, there's too many restrictions on the commons. And on the other, tragedy of the commons, on the other hand, you have too few restrictions. So those are kind of the two ways that a commons in general can break down for folks.
How does that apply to open source software?
This is actually really interesting because open source has characteristics of a commons, but it also has characteristics of what we call a public good. Economists talk about goods according to two properties, excludability and rivalry. So excludability is like, can you prevent somebody from using the resource or the good? So think about air as an example of a non-excludable resource. You can't prevent somebody from going outside and breathing the air. Whereas, this mug that I'm holding in my hand with the tea in it, that's an excludable good because I can prevent you from having it. On the other hand, you have rivalry, which is if I use a good, can somebody else not use it? So the cup, if I have the good, you can't have the cup as well. But air is a non-rivalrous resource. I breathe the air, you breathe the air, is how we would think of that. When we use that kind of basic general economics framing to think about open source, what it does is you look at two properties, each with two characteristics. That means you've got four possibilities. Open source software, in terms of the bits and the bytes, you go to GitHub and you download something. That as a resource, a digital resource, an informational good, is neither excludable nor rivalrous, meaning you can download something a billion times from NPM and it's still there to download for the billion plus one person. So software as an information good, as some bits and bytes up on the internet, is what we call a public good, non-excludable, non-rivalrous. Okay, now let's shift to commons. A commons, when we think about these categories, is not excludable. I can't prevent somebody from going out into the sea and trying to catch some fish, let's say. But that pool of fish is actually limited.
Sure.
And if you have enough people out there fishing, then there's not enough fish to go around at some point. So that's that idea of rivalry. So it's non-excludable. You can't prevent people from getting at it, but it's also rivalrous. If too many people access that resource, then it becomes a problem. We end up with, going back to what we were saying, that tragedy of the commons. When we talk about open source, we also need to talk about maintainer attention. So maintainers, because if you think about GitHub, yes, you can go there and you can download, the software, but you can also file a bug. You can also go to that issues tab and click new issue and file a bug, file a feature request. And so as those features pile up in issues, as those tickets pile up in the issue tracker, that puts more and more demands on the attention of the maintainer, on the person who's maintaining the project. And so that then we think of as this kind of scarce resource.
So your blog post also very intriguingly mentioned something called the CodeCov kerfuffle last year.
Oh, wow.
So what is
Yeah.
CodeCov and what was the kerfuffle?
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the intro, I work at a company called Sentry, which is a developer tools company. And probably a year and a half ago now, we acquired another company called CodeCov, which is a testing coverage tool, another developer tool. And when we bought CodeCov, they were closed source. Sentry has a deep, deep commitment to open source. We started life as an open source side project way back in 2008. Open source is a core part of our company culture. So when we bought CodeCov, it took probably about 6 months, but we did end up publishing the source code for CodeCov. And in the announcement, we said, CodeCov is now open source. But the catch is the particular license that we were using for CodeCov is the same one we were using for Sentry at the time. It's called the Business Source License, which, has definitely been in the... Actually, HashiCorp's relicensing, I think, was like the same news cycle as or like one after as CodeCov.
Wow.
Yeah, so we caught some flack for relicensing CodeCov, but we called it open source even though it was BSL. And so the kerfuffle was kind of the community pushback on using that term open source when it was technically not open source initiative approved license.
So can you talk first about the move to the business source license and then how the CodeCov kerfuffle changed things?
Sentry started life, again, as an open source side project. Originally, it was licensed under BSD 3 clause. Actually, originally, there was no license, and then it was BSD 3 clause. And then 2019, we had some real threats from some other actors, some other companies who were looking to undercut Sentry's hosting business. Sentry's always been a single source open source project. We're the ones that build and maintain it. Nobody else materially contributes to it. We welcome contributions. We get them occasionally. But yeah, there were some risks to the business from other companies taking Sentry without giving anything back. And undercutting our business that enables us to keep building Sentry. So in 2019, we looked around and we found the business source license and thought, hey, that's great. It really did work for us to kind of take away that risk that these larger companies who aren't giving back anything to the development and maintenance of Sentry are making money off of Sentry, while still allowing anybody to download and run Sentry internally. The way our BSL worked is that you could still self-host Sentry. So we don't monetize self-hosted. We let anybody who wants to download Sentry, run it for themselves. The restriction in our BSL and now in this functional source license is that you can't run a competing SaaS service. Then CodeCov was early August of last year, got this immediate pushback from the community on this concept of open source doesn't apply to BSL. And that really started a lot of soul searching for us. We actually turned around the next day and said, okay, you're right. We'll see the point. We apologized on that one. But then we really started thinking. There was an interesting comment from Adam Jacob, the Chef co-founder, in Twitter dialogue around that CodeCov kerfuffle, where he said, I suspect the way forward is for companies like Sentry to band together, define your own set of values, and come up with a name for that. Just don't call it open source. It's great. Whatever it is, just don't call it open source. So that kind of started us on this journey about 6 months ago. A month later, I published a blog post that said, here's Sentry's open source values. And that's where we got to this idea that free and open source software prioritizes and really exclusively focuses on user freedom, on the rights of the user, the freedom to run and read and modify and redistribute software. What's missing from that is this other piece of kind of the needs of the maintainers of the software, going back to what we're talking about, the tragedy of the commons and the limited maintainer attention. So this concept of maintainer sustainability, developer sustainability, balancing that against user freedom. That's what we came up with as kind of our articulation of values. And then from there, we did end up looking at the business source license. We thought there were maybe some issues with it, but we did come out with the functional source license, which is kind of our cleanup of the BSL. That came out in November. And then we worked with the Open Source Initiative to publish a white paper on the general practice of what they ended up calling delayed open source publication. So they did kind of this independent research white paper on that, kind of the history of that practice, of which BSL and FSL are current examples. So that, I think, we announced in January. And then lately, Software Commons is the current conversation point for us.
So that links CodeCov kerfuffle to Software Commons, which we'll definitely get into. But I also was wondering if that ties in with the functional source license, or is that a separate track?
Yeah, FSL is a step on the way. The business source license, we really like the general shape of it, that it's this, delayed open source publication. The basics of the BSL say after 4 years, this code reverts to a true open source license. Until then, you can do anything you want with it except, in our case, we said compete with us in SaaS. The challenge with BSL is that that except is kind of a big fill in the blank. It's called the additional use grant. And every company fills it in differently. So, HashiCorp's BSL is very different than Sentry's BSL, which is very different than MariaDB's BSL, et cetera. So that kind of limits its scalability and adoption in the industry, because every compliance department, you see BSL 1.1 and you still have to double click and say, all right, what does the thing actually say? So what we wanted to do with FSL was take the best of the BSL, buff out the rough edges and say, okay, instead of this parameterized thing, maybe it's 4 years, maybe it's longer, maybe it's less, we're only going to do 2 years.
Okay.
So FSL is only 2 years, and it's only one of two change licenses or future licenses, Apache or MIT. And then, the third thing is that we close that additional use grant hole. So there's just one set of language around not competing. Competing uses, we say, are prevented for 2 years. All the while chewing on this larger question of like, what's this new brand? What's this new thing? What's this new, maybe it's a movement, and maybe that's not a word we use for it. But, what is this thing that we're not the only ones who have this issue? Founders of software companies these days just kind of gravitate, a lot of them gravitate towards, well, I'd like to publish my code if I could. I like open source. I'd like to publish it if I could. And, it's an opportunity for us because Sentry's been around a little longer. So we've kind of trodden this path. And the question is like, all right, can we find, in the same way that with open source, there was like a lot of proliferation of licenses, especially early on. And we kind of dialed in or converged on, well, here's GPL if you want to do copyleft. Here's Apache or MIT if you want to do permissive. And it really kind of shook out into these few common licenses. That's the same thing we're trying to look at on this other side, which is like, you want to build a company, you want it to be open source, you want your core product to be open source. That's the space we're trying to explore here. And Software Commons is kind of the heading for it at this point.
And I know it's early for those efforts, but can you talk about what you've come up with so far there and how they address open source sustainability?
So what's really wonderful about that term Software Commons is that it is so well suited to the reality that we see, going back to where we started with these ideas, the tragedy of the commons and enclosure, the security issues that kind of get our attention when there's a heartbleed or a log4shell or something like this. I see them as symptoms of open source sustainability being in crisis, not necessarily the root cause. The root cause is that, the maintainers aren't able to work on the software. People are burning out.
Yeah.
Okay. Maintainer burnout is the core thing that I think we need to focus on. So that's kind of what we're thinking through right now. Software Commons as a framing really gives us this language to think about the problems that we're facing. Commons have been well studied for many generations, well outside of software. So there's this whole rich tradition of the commons, of understanding how to address these issues of enclosure and tragedy of the commons that we can learn from. And this is kind of, again, we'll see where we end up with this, but kind of the current state of the conversation is, from my point of view, the answers when we look at the literature on how to protect against the tragedy of the commons, it's really about designing institutions. And so then the question is, okay, if the way to manage a commons is through a particular kind of institutional design. We got a bunch of institutions. Are any of those adequate? Yes or no? Why or why not? But I think really this piece around maintainer attention is the core of it. So that's kind of where my head's at right now is, wow, all right, Software Commons really does seem to be a good framing for this. But wow, that's a lot of work if we're talking about either changing some institutions that we already have or coming up with new institutions. Yeah, it's a big challenge.
Can you clarify also, do you see maintainer attention and the need for companies like yours to make revenue as one and the same kind of problem, or are they separate but related issues? How do those two things tie together?
I think in terms of two broad categories of software sharing, it's not a binary, is the thing shared or not shared. Open source has staked out one far end of that. And even in open source, there's restrictions, like you can share it as long as you give us attribution. You can share it as long as you share alike. You can share it as long as you don't, initiate patent litigation, right? There's some kind of restrictions that are acceptable within that open source movement. But they've kind of staked out the far end of that sharing spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is closed source. So there's a lot of ground between closed source and open source. Source available is the term that's kind of generally used for that ground, but it's so broad as to be kind of meaningless. Maybe that's the right term to use long term. I don't think so, because it is so broad. Because source available could even include, you sign an NDA to see somebody's source code, which isn't really public sharing. The other one I like to work with is open products, because again, there's different kinds of software.
Right.
A library that you're using, a small NPM module is very different than, for example, a Sentry or a CodeCov, this full-featured web app that you're going to stand up and run on a server somewhere for your company. We need to find that middle ground that gives these entrepreneurs that are coming along that are familiar with open source but want to build a business on their software and build kind of excellent consumer grade software, because we don't see that from open source. Let's be honest. Open source has carried the day for operating systems and for libraries and developer tools, but it has not carried the day for end user software. So I think there's a really interesting space here if we can look at open products as a way to say, okay, companies, you're coming along, you're building a new software business. You would make your software public if you could. Here's a way to do that. Let's call it an open product. Let's say, that FSL license that we came out with is maybe a good fit for a number of folks. Maybe there's some other models, open core, maybe some different other models. But let's kind of gather that under a heading that we can say, next time we buy another CodeCov and go to make that blog post, what's the headline on that blog post? If it's not going to be CodeCov is open source, what is it? CodeCov is what? CodeCov is an open product. Something like this. CodeCov is part of the software commons, something like this. That's sort of a thought experiment or way that we're thinking about it.
Great. Very interesting things. We live in interesting times, as they say.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing what you're working on here, and I look forward to hearing how it goes.
Cool. Thanks, Beth.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariseau, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about open source principles and sustainability. Thank you for being with us so far.